Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this part two of our DE&I panel. This is a follow-up to last December. It's hard to believe that it's been 12 months already, but a lot has happened in these 12 months, and just want to thank our panelists for joining us again this year. We have a new panelist this year, so welcome, Rashida. Again, we'll be starting it off very shortly. Just to point out something, if you have a question, please, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A section. Please submit your questions in that Q&A rather than the chat. We will be monitoring the Q&A box and try to get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Chief Diversity Officer for Buchanan Ingersoll, Lloyd Freeman.
Well, it's always great to get that kind of a riveting introduction. Thank you, John. And welcome again to our panel discussion. This is, of course, the Alumni Workplace Engagement Business Forum. Again, we're having a real conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But this one has sort of the sub-marquee title of the Where Are We Now? Because as John mentioned, it was literally a year ago to the date that I was together with at least two of the panelists, and we decided to round out this rock star lineup of panelists with one new addition. So let me get to those introductions so we can jump into this real conversation. I'm joined with Veronica Acevedo. She is a 2014 graduate of the Rutgers Business School, and she's the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for SoundCloud. We also have Brenda Wagner, who is the 91 graduate of Rutgers College and also a 93 graduate of the Graduate School in New Brunswick. She's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and Vice President of HR Transformation and Integration at LabCorp. And our newest addition is another good friend of mine, Rashida MacMurray-Abdullah, and she's a 2002 graduate of the Law School in Newark, and she currently serves as the Chief Diversity Officer at Wiley down in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of the panelists. Hopefully they're off mute by now. Okay, good. So there would be no reunion special if we didn't kind of talk about what has happened since the last time we were together. And certainly a lot has changed since we met last year for our roundtable discussion, but a lot has remained the same. I recall I was in my house. Brenda, I recall that background. You were in your house. So we're still at home. We're still trying to foster inclusive workplaces from afar. So certainly a lot has changed, but a lot has remained the same as well. Brenda, I'm going to start with you, but I would love to hear from all of the panelists. What have been some of the best programs and initiatives that you introduced to your respective companies and firms in the past 12 months to help really advance DEI in your workplace?
Yes, so at LabCorp, if I think back to a year ago, I definitely think we've made more momentum and progress around overall awareness from a diversity and inclusion perspective. I remember talking last year too that different companies are at different places in the kind of the journey. We were earlier, and I think we're still early, but we've made momentum, but have a lot more to do as we look ahead. But with that, probably some of the areas that I think have been valuable. One is really for us, the tone at the top. Our CEO last year and was consistent this year around really reinforcing authentically the commitment and that diversity and inclusion is an important business and talent priority. He's been consistent. It engages with our employee resource groups, and that translates to his leadership team. That's really important, and that sets the right tone and message. What we want to do is live up to that as a company, and we don't want to lose that. So going into next year, we want to keep it and do more and go deeper. Another area for us is this past year, we've really brought at least to his directs, kind of our executive committee on a quarterly basis, what does your diversity profile look like, including what are the trends when it comes to hiring, attrition, and promotions. And it's been pretty insightful. And so we want to do more of that and go deeper and put a little bit more of action plans too, as we go into next year. But really having the visibility to that has been important. And then probably two areas of focus. One is really our employee resource groups, which many companies do have. We had 4 prior to last year and launched last year a Black employee resource group called Pulse, thanks to several of our amazing employees, and one for people with disability, and then this year Hispanic and Asian. We have 8. It's so important just the energy and people feeling seen and heard and the sense of belonging. So that's important to expand. And then finally, for us, we did have been launching unconscious bias kind of learning journey for our people leaders. And about 90% have gone through, and that's globally. And we really want to think about how do we reinforce the learnings next year. So those are some of the initiatives that we've had.
No, and I love that, especially from an inclusion standpoint, when you talk about having actual workshops that are specifically tailored for your people leaders. That to me hits home because so many people talk about how, of course, the tone starts at the top and you need to have the CEOs buy in. But I don't know about any of my co-panelists, but I've never really seen anyone quit their job because of the CEO and what he or she or they have articulated to be, the ethos of the organization or not. You leave because of those people managers and whether or not they have that emotional intelligence and they can really empathize and understand, some of the things that you're going through. So I think that's very, very sound. Rashida, I'm turning to you because you were just starting at your current firm about a year ago. So now that you've been there for a full year, what have been some of your proudest accomplishments? What initiatives have you launched?
Yeah, so thank you guys for having me. And it's a pleasure to join the group. You mentioned like one of the things that we're all still in the same space. Well, actually today we're moving to a new office. And so we don't start our new office on Monday. So I'm in that office. But aside from that, I'm still, doing the same things. And over the past year, what we really focused on was recruiting. And where were we recruiting from? How are we going out to market to talk about our lateral opportunities? And then coupled with that, how are we doing our branding externally? Or where we making sure that our voice matched with what we wanted to see within our organization? So for example, we also, similar to Brenda, we launched an unconscious bias training that was firm-wide for just our law firm leaders. So that went to our partners and our counsel, and trying to be very intentional about setting the conversation there. Because we knew that if we had those kind of day-to-day experiences that most of the people in our organization encounter, and if we could start there, we could permeate out and then be able to couple it with our managing partner who was reinforcing that it was a really big deal for us to be focused on diversity. And because like a lot of law firms who went from having maybe a manager or director, a lot of law firms created new chief roles. And the whole purpose was was to elevate and have somebody who was just laser focused on these issues. And so even though the firm may get busy with the move or we may get busy at year end, there was still somebody in the room who said, hey, remember that we talked about diversity, equity, inclusion? How do we continue to keep it relevant? And so I think I'm most proud of the fact that when we looked at last year, just taking a small demographic is our Black lawyers. We had 8 when I started. We're now at 15 or 16. And so that's a pretty phenomenal in 1 year, right? To have made the needle. We started another new affinity group, which was really awesome. We have Asian and Pacific American lawyers. So now we have 8 diversity focused affinity groups that are working together. And I actually think the conversation, we've been able to move the conversation. It's not just because I'm here, it's because the firm said that we want to make DEI a priority. So now everybody feels comfortable raising it. And it's always such a pleasure when I get emails from different people throughout the organization that'll say, hey, I was thinking about this, or I saw this program. And so I feel like there was an outlet. People wanted to be able to share this information, but didn't have anyone to share it with.
Love that. Great. Okay, so Veronica, you have to round us out. And I know you've only been at SoundCloud for a few months, but are there anything that you've already rolled out that you are particularly already proud of that you want to talk to us about?
Sure. I'll add 2 additional points. One is the creation at both of my companies, Expedia, who I left, and at SoundCloud. We initiated some cross-functional task forces or committees that was focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that was great because it made everyone accountable towards DE&I, not just the DEI team or HR who had been doing a lot of the work before that. And then it focused beyond just internal efforts of recruiting, retaining, that's definitely important. But now as a marketer, how do I apply this in my role working with artists? As an engineer, how do I look for algorithms that might have bias? So really having that cross-functional task force, I think, has been so great to scale DE&I across the company. And then secondly, Both companies, again, we were able to get the employee resource group leaders time allotment to do their work. So before they had been doing it on the side, so a lot of them were doing it after work. Some of them have said their managers have no idea they're doing it. They're kind of keeping it quiet so that it doesn't affect their main work. And now we've rolled out where 10% of their time, so in a 40-hour work week, that's 4 hours a week that they can give during work hours to do this work. Their manager is aware of it, and it's part of their performance reviews. So they're getting more recognition for their work and not feeling like they have to do it on the side.
I love that. I love that. Anything that you do on the side is going to be treated like a hobby and like something that you could cut out at any given time. But the fact that you're actually building it into their regular work routine and are also getting regular work credit for it, it gives it a lot more, gravitas and some more credence that maybe it didn't have before that. So I love that. I'm going to stick with you though, Veronica, because oftentimes when we have these conversations around DEI, you are inevitably, despite our best efforts and all these wonderful programs and initiatives you all already articulated, there are simply some individuals who feel left out of the conversation. And I think that can happen for a number of different reasons. For starters, when you start to look at all the different social identifiers that we tease out, we talk about women, we talk about people of color. I heard you talk about, your ERGs and your affinity groups. And so there are some people who say, well, I don't really see a space for me. So maybe this isn't a conversation that I can participate in. Or maybe they're not familiar with the vocabulary, and so if I don't really know the right letters to put into that particular acronym, I'm just going to stay away from it. I'm not going to use it. So for whatever reason, they tend to shy away from the organization's DEI programming. How do you help to get everyone involved in DEI at your company?
Great question. I'd say we start by an onboarding. Every new joiner gets an onboarding to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we talk about the many different dimensions of diversity. So of course, people are very familiar with gender, sexual orientation, race, and ethnicity. And if you have privilege and you're in a majority of any of those, then you kind of start to feel like, I guess this isn't for me. But when you define that, it could also be caregiver status. Are you caring for a child or an adult? It could be introversion. It could be disability. Then you start to get a wider pool of those who might have felt like they weren't a part of the original conversation. And then we ground them in that common language. So we want everyone coming in to have some familiarity with when we talk about DE&I, what does each stand for? What does that mean here, right? LGBTQIA, what does that mean? And what are some quick practical tips that they could start going very like 101 from like sharing pronouns. What exactly does that mean? Why is that important for the LGBTQIA community? So we start there. And I'd suggest if your company doesn't have onboarding, just having maybe a team meeting that starts with, can we all ground ourselves on learning a little more about each other and how we could better support each other and the different identities that we hold? And then how do you weave it again into your role? So how I try to get a lot of people on board is beyond building an inclusive team, how can you now bring this into your work? So in a tech company where we have SoundCloud platform, there's teams that are scouting our platform for hate speech, right? How can we better help them with how to scout that out, flag it, remove that content? For those who are working with artists, are they surveying the artists to understand the diversity of our artists? Or is our roster only very male dominated, very one race dominated? So there are ways that I try to share that you can get involved, even if you don't hold one of those underrepresented identities.
And it's important, particularly I know in the practice of law, Rashida. That's a profession I'm very familiar with. And not only are you combating some of the things we talked about earlier, where I don't identify, I don't know the vocabulary, I can tell you that in a law firm, people are also busy. And so then how do you end up engaging everyone in your DEI initiatives, considering how busy everyone is and all the other obstacles you already have to overcome?
Yeah, and so we feel like it's about setting the tone early. So we do the same thing that they do with SoundCloud. I actually, as part of orientation, for every attorney that joins our firm, I am part of the welcome onboarding agenda. So I'm meeting with them either their first or second day joining the firm. And then similarly for our professional staff, the manager on my team, she does the same thing in orientation. So we know that at least when you're coming in the door, we've set the tone and had shown you what the expectations are here. We also have some onboarding videos which we've updated to really talk about specifically defining diversity, equity, inclusion, stereotypes, and bias. And then people are required that as part of the onboarding process that you have to take. And then we have a little bit more advanced that we'll be rolling out in 2022. But I do think that as you continue to bring in more people into the organization, once people know that that's the expectation, that you are going to be part of this very diverse, inclusive culture, then people understand and they internalize it themselves. Now, with respect to people who've been here, I feel like one of the challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more, is that how do you get connected virtually? And so I am looking forward to kind of like as we return to the office, not necessarily return to work, because everybody has been working over the past year, but having those moments that matter for people to have intentional connections so that they're feeling like they're part of the team. And the group that I most worry about is our laterals, right? Because, including myself, right? We all joined in a pandemic. And so how do we kind of navigate? We've just been boxes, and having that really focusing on the belonging and the connection. And so although I think initially, traditionally people didn't have time for that, I think that people are craving for that, right? And that's why people really want to get together because, being in the box, you can do some things, but there's nothing as powerful as that first opportunity to just meet somebody in person, even if it's 5 minutes.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, it starts from kind of like in an interview, in those first 30 seconds, you get a chance to make an impression. And so if I don't get that connection in those first couple of weeks when I have onboarded or just started a new job, you may not get me. So, okay, Brenda, round us out. Talk to me about ways in which you're able to engage everyone in this kind of conversation.
Yes, and it's interesting, back to us being home and Rashida, what you were just mentioning. I've been at LabCorp a year and a half, so I started right when people are sent home. And again, we have a lot of our employees that are at the labs, frontline workers, but office-based employees have been home. And I was so excited. I just came from a leadership meeting with one of our leads. It was my second in-person meeting, so I was like giddy. Talking about D&I, I was just so excited because it's been all more through webcasts. And I do like both what Rashida and Veronica mentioned about kind of common language, and that's something I think we can do more of with our company more broadly, defining what's meant by D&I. I think back to the question of some things we do, part of it's really trying to always describe the why. And I know, like for me personally, spend a lot of time with the different leadership teams, like I just mentioned, or town halls or different, groups. But I think the more there's always the why, and that inclusion really benefits everybody. You really want an inclusive environment where everybody's voices, and really a place where people can be lifted and do their best work. And that, it's kind of a rising tide lifts all boats. So I think the more we can all communicate, how this benefits the all, while also, reinforcing that people are at different places and there are different struggles of, different groups, different constituencies in the organization. And, again, that's why we do need to lean in and focus on different areas. So there's kind of the overall why, overall, how does this benefit everybody? But acknowledging, back to kind of the equity piece, different unique challenges for different groups of people. And that's why we need to lean in. And I think two other things come to my mind. One is kind of meeting people where they are. So I know some organizations you can drive quickly, and or within groups, others might take a little bit longer. And so some of it is, a little bit of patience with the sense of urgency. So you don't want to, take off the gas, but I know I'm like, want to see progress or change quick, but it does come, or a lot of the team members, right? They're coming in and they want to see it faster. But actually it is happening, and celebrating those wins along the way, which might get to my last point, was just testimonials. And it's great when we see and hear the voices of our employees from our employee resource groups, but broadly, and also the leaders that, might be in the majority. It's good when they also authentically share, the why, or what they've learned from being involved, or how they're engaged and how they're an ally. The more, people see those stories and testimonials, it kind of weaves a little bit more into the fabric as well.
God, I love that. That is great. And so, everything that the three of you just outlined, we all left smiling. Oh my gosh, that sounds wonderful. That's great. You're able to get everyone into the conversation, but this is a real conversation. And let's be real, despite all of your best efforts, you're not going to get everyone to participate. Sometimes you're even going to get some individuals who push back and don't even believe in some of the work that you're doing, or they refuse to make it a part of their business function. And so, Rashida, because I know that lawyers are very strong-willed, how do you combat this? What are some of the challenges you faced, and how are you combating this when you're trying to get people excited and get them engaged and involved in DEI, and they want nothing to do with it?
So I often find that you have multiple constituents, so you need to have a multi-pronged approach. So you definitely want to spend a lot of time with the people who get it, right? Who are going to get on board, who are going to be ambassadors, who are going to be able to make the direct change. And you have to think of the individuals who are very skeptical or like, this is just another thing, it's a passing phase, why do I have to do this? You think about them and you think about it the long term, right? So perhaps maybe they're not convinced by it's the right thing to do or it's touchy-feely. Then you go after the numbers and you have to present the data and show, and I think Veronica, you had mentioned like you had the stats in terms of attrition and performance, or was that you, Brenda? Somebody said about having those metrics, right? Because those are the things that matter. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about data, it's not just about whether people come and stay and they thrive. We know that there's been many studies that individuals, employees, if they feel valued, if they belong, they perform better. They perform at a higher, they're going to go beyond what you need, right? They're just going to perform at a higher level. In individuals where you made them marginalized, they don't have a voice, they're just going to go through the motions. They're not going to be your top performers, and you may need their special skill set. And then not only that, if that's not convincing, let's just talk about the data. How much money are you losing by bringing somebody in and not having them maximize their value to your organization? And so those are tend to be the conversations that people get the aha moment. Like, okay, you spent all this money recruiting them, you brought them to the organization, but if they're not performing, it's just money out the door. And you're like, oh, well, we can replace that person. You really can't replace them because it's a whole nother set of money that you're bringing on board. And so that to me has been the way, maybe not to make them believers, but at least not necessarily be obstacles to what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and opening their eyes, because those are the realities of the situation. And I can only imagine, Brenda, your organization is much larger. And so I can only imagine you're going to get, some pushback because inevitably you can't reach everyone. How are you combating some of that and trying to then change people's minds? I mean, this is a bit of change management here. And so making sure that people turn that corner and that they get on board.
Yeah, I think again, the more, back to reinforce some of the things we said earlier, but then, also recognize some of the realities and challenges. I mean, again, it's important that, leaders, management continue to reinforce it is important and the why. So it's not just like a check the box thing. I think we do have to realize not everyone's going to jump into the, focus here. And so sometimes you have to leave. If you just force it, people can counter react, right? So part of it's kind of respecting that lens, unless people do act counter. If they're acting counter to your values, if they are causing, issues, like that's not acceptable. It's not okay. And especially if they're in positions of power, influence with management and leaders. So I think one thing too is even for ourselves, as we're looking ahead, holding more and more, accountability, but we're not seeing demonstrated, particularly from leadership. And for us, we did launch this past year kind of leadership values, behaviors. For us, it's called Leadership ID. It's got like 4 behaviors. And now we want to drive more and more of, we really do expect you to demonstrate and also try to bring these leaders along on how you can do that too. For example, one of the areas is around developing our people. And a lot of the leaders are not focused. They're just going to deliver. So, what does it mean to be able to develop? And then again, if you're not really demonstrating that over time, how does that impact your standing as a manager?
Okay, Veronica, but I'm going to take a little bit of a spin on it when I turn to you, Veronica, and I really want you to give us maybe one of the biggest challenges that you have faced, whether it's, at your current position or as one of your peers. What are some of the biggest challenges you face? Because I think that we kind of talk about these things and sometimes we don't get into the granular and find out how to navigate it. And while you're thinking about your answer to that, I want to encourage all of our attendees who are watching the webinar, to the extent that there are challenges in your organization, or you need some advice as to how to navigate a particular issue around advancing DEI, we would love to hear from you. So we do have the Q&A function. It's enabled, and we can get to any of your questions and hopefully weave them into our conversation so we can help you and you can walk away with some tools to really affect some change in your organization. But Veronica, give us some examples. What are some challenges you face? How have you navigated it?
Sure. I'd say back to something that was mentioned, was the time that you need to execute, inclusive work, DE&I work streams. When I joined SoundCloud, it was the first time I joined a company where I was starting as a team of one versus being on bigger DEI teams. And so my biggest challenge was there's been a lot of listening tours, a lot over the last few years. We've gone to employees, we've listened, we've documented their challenges, but what are the actions that we're taking? And even if there were little actions being taken, just no one had the time to communicate it out, or a lot of people felt this isn't big enough to communicate out, so we're just gonna stay quiet until we do something bigger. So coming in, a remedy was, let's start being more transparent of where work streams are, giving out updates more frequently, bringing DEI as a topic up at town halls, right on our Slack channels and our newsletters. We need to just communicate more what's going on, even if it's those small wins. And then building informal teams. So of course, employee resource group leaders, I see them as extended members of the team. People who have been leading smaller work streams around this, those are informal members too. So finding those people, especially when you're a team of one, until we're able to hire more, I think is something to consider.
That's a huge thing to consider, particularly as we were talking about, again, making sure that everyone is looking at this as not something that's performative, and we just kind of put
Right.
Veronica into her role so we can check the box and say, oh, we've got a D&I professional. No, you wouldn't do that if it was relating to the finances or if it was relating to IT or marketing. So we want to make sure that we're giving diversity its just due and respect. There is a question that has come through in the private chat to me, and I'm going to open it up to anyone, whoever wants to jump in, but are there any standard practices that promote inclusive behavior that you've seen that have been adopted widely and enacted that have really made a for real difference in the workplace? And this is irrespective of the industry. So any policies or standard practices, best practices that any of you have seen implemented or implemented yourself that have absolutely made some kind of a real difference in your organization?
I'll jump in for, go ahead. Yeah, please. Go ahead, Rashida.
I was just going to say, I think last year there was a big push for the transparency and we really revealing what the numbers are. I think it's the best practice for a couple of reasons why it keeps your organization accountable, but I think it allows everybody to kind of own the issue. So I think to Ron's point, when you're not really sharing, people think nothing's happening, which is probably far from the truth. But there was this fear about, well, if we disclose what our problem is, then either we have to manage it or we have to solve it. So I have seen that be a best practice where people are learning how to be more accountable and transparent and how they're reporting out. So they're saying, yeah, these are what our numbers are, and this is what our aggressive goal is, and this is what we're trying to do to achieve it.
Brenda, you had something to add there?
Yeah, and it was a little bit more of a tactic, if you will. And it was more my former firm that I worked at as well, which was really around that culture of appreciation. Like people just really do want to be appreciated. And we did do more of a launch around, the outreach of appreciation and, recognition and writing thank yous and having a day or two that was just about outreach and appreciation that took place through the year. And that just gets back to the kind of inclusive environment, where we really wanted people to be deliberate about the outreach, and particularly think about folks that are heads down, just working hard to do their roles, to really do the thanks, not just the big projects where, gets the attention already. I think that's one area. And then otherwise too, one area that I think that we've kind of focused on, but again, we have kind of company-wide, and part of this is how do you bring it to the employees? The more you have to just check in, I think, especially over this past year, about, are you okay? And reminding people too about your EAP and your other types of services like that. And we certainly communicate through the year company-wide, which can get kind of lost in all the messaging, but there's, and we've reached out, we have a newsletter goes to our managers or people leaders, and there was times we highlighted, but that was one area where particularly some of our employee resource groups leaned in, particularly our Black employee resource group was really more around, mental health and wellness. And that was, again, self-led from the group, what's the needs? And as we look particularly at our Black community, but again, our company at large, has different offerings. I think where we want to leverage is how do you bring it back again so people feel it for them, and in a way that resonates with the different constituencies. So I do think that wellness focus and appreciation, however that might come to life, in one's company, that's something that touches all our people in one way or the other.
Oh, it is. And it's so amazing how such a simple sentence like, are you okay, ends up being so extremely powerful. Number one, it lets the individual employee know that they are cared about and that they are seen and that it matters that they can voice what's going on with them and that you think about them as more than an employee number or some kind of a bot, who's there for productivity, but they're a person and people go through things. And we want to know what it is that you are going through so we can know how we can support you. Very, very powerful. But I want to break down something because we've been throwing out, the term ERG. We've been talking about our affinity groups. Rashida talked about launching a new one. Brenda talks about heavily relying upon her Black ERG. Veronica talked about them being an extension of her team. So when you are rolling out affinity groups or when you're expanding them and adding a new one, how do you get buy-in from the most senior individuals in the organization, your executives, to actually implement and roll them out and have them be established? And then once the affinity groups or ERGs are started, how do you keep them focused? How do they stay on task and make sure that they are actually helping to foster more inclusion? I'll get it started and then, I'll see which one of you wants to join. For each of our affinity groups at my firm, we have executive sponsors. And so these individuals absolutely act in the exact same role that your individual sponsor would be as you're navigating your profession. You want someone who's going to be able to use their influence and their position, their gravitas in the organization to be able to champion for you when you're not in the room. And so I think that it's one thing to have, an individual who's a part of that group who takes on a leadership role and is the chairperson. That's great. So, you have your ERG chair. And then, of course, you have your D&I professional, you're, one of us who is overseeing that, and they're an extension of our team. But people expect for us to talk about D&I. It's another thing when I can get an executive level sponsor, someone who's on our board, someone who's a part of our C-suite, who's not the CDIO, who's talking about, these are the ways in which we can support the women who work in our firm. And these are the ways in which we can support, working parents and provide them some better resources. So for me, I was able to get that buy-in because I absolutely pulled them into the conversation. This wasn't going to be an affinity group for those people. This was going to be an affinity group for these individuals, their allies, and you as an executive. So whichever one of you wants to chime in, how did you leverage the others in your organization and get that buy-in when you rolled those affinity groups out?
Yeah, I'll just start too. It's similar to what you said. Like there is a governance, kind of a little bit of a process. So if people want to, start an affinity group or employee resource group or business resource group, you want to think about what guidelines you want to set, guidance. And there's a lot of best practices or common practices out there for maybe some, those of you in the WebEx that want to start some up. But just like you mentioned, Lloyd, everyone does need to have an executive sponsor. So as a team starts up, they can get guidance from our D&I team, make sure there's an executive sponsor. And then likewise, what we've added over the past year was an executive sponsor, but also at the top, our executive committee reporting the CEO. Each ERG needs to have we've assigned one of those senior executives, and there may not be as involved in the day-to-day, but it brings that message to the very top. So it's, not just a vice president or a different leader within the organizations at the both. We also, my team saw there's a lot of activity. So they did create a little bit of a board of directors or kind of a board. So each ERG has 1 or 2 leads that once a month they get together, and that way they can talk about budgets and best practices. And my team's been running that. They've been amazing. And then also, because of the sheer volume, and we have chapters and ERGs across the globe, it was hard to kind of keep up. And so we ended up having a tool that was labeled We Belong, that is great. We use, and that way, that's where people post all their activities, the ERGs. So there's pages, but you can go and see in the calendar all the ERG activities. They can do newsletters from there. And that's really been amazing, because that's a way to help, have a central place to communicate and for other people to see the activity. And there's a lot of capability there. And it wasn't too expensive, but it got to a point where just the volume was high. And so that just helped to get visibility and even the ERGs to, manage communications and plans.
Veronica, did you have something to add there?
Sure, that tool sounds amazing. That's something I'd love to implement down the road, because we're starting pretty scrappy, and we have some like Excel spreadsheets where people could track with their activations, what's the increase in membership, what was some qualitative feedback from the event. So at least getting them started, I'd say, to start measuring the impact of their events, because originally a lot of these employee resource groups are very social, affinity focused, which is great because they are building that sense of community. But then once you start giving them budget from the business and you want to prove back to senior leaders that they're having an impact, that's where you need them to start tracking the impact of their events. So I'd say that. And then also I've built just a simple form where if a part of the business wants to work with the employee resource group, they fill out that form. For example, if there's a new campaign they want to do and they want to make sure that they have the voices of people of color involved, then they could fill that out. And then we check in with the employee resource group to see their bandwidth and if they're able to collaborate with them. So I'd say another way to have more business impact beyond just social.
Yes, no, I think it has to in order for it to be sustainable, because we already have, some of our smaller social networks, folks that we go to lunch with, folks we commiserate with in the workplace, but we want this to have a little bit more. But Rashida, I'm going to switch gears on you, because, and again, we've been talking about so many different issues and so much has come up over the past 18 months or so, and diversity has absolutely been the buzzword. I am sure when any of you signs on to LinkedIn, you're probably getting bombarded with all these requests from individuals who want to steal you from your current organization, or you see someone in your network who just became a new chief diversity and inclusion officer somewhere else, or someone just launched their own new shop and they're doing some consulting work. So Rashida, this has absolutely been at the forefront of everything that every company has been doing for the past 18 months. And some are now arguing that we're suffering from diversity fatigue, that the fatigue is setting in and we're tired of it. I mean, can we talk about something else? What's your response to that, Rashida, the critique that we're now suffering from diversity fatigue?
It's such a luxury to be able to be fatigued, right? And so I understand from a perspective, but I also think that it's a very interesting time, because people who have been in the space, and and as Lloyd had shared, I started this role last October, but it was a hobby for quite some time, of like most of my career. So the opportunity to be able to focus on it full time. And when we're talking about being fatigued, it's such a business imperative. It is what we have to do in order for our organizations to be successful. It's not just a nice to have. And so I think the premise would be, you don't go to your financial team and say, we're really just tired about having internal controls, right? The fraud will run rampant, right? I mean, and sometimes it can be, my side note is that, I used to do financial fraud investigations, so I love that area. But the reality is you have to have these types of control. And I feel like we're only just really scratching at the surface. And the thought is once you know from a historical standpoint how interconnected all of these issues are, then people are like, oh my God, we have to be energized. I think some of the fatigue comes from, this is really daunting because it shows up in so many aspects of our organizations that we just assumed, you know, that's just the way it was. But we didn't really question it. Now we're realizing, because we've had this pandemic and our eyes have been, you know, illuminated, that the things we were doing weren't really serving us. And so why would we continue to go down a road where we're not really being served? So I think it's even more inspiring, although it may seem like this is the topic of why people are talking about it. When you just look at the stats, what it looked like for even the law schools have, I'll just talk about the legal industry. Law schools have been producing more female or more women graduates since 2014. If you look at the ranks of the leadership of most top law firms, it is the complete opposite. You wouldn't think that you had that pipeline, right? And so we haven't really achieved to the place where we collectively, and instead of just having, you know, a few individuals who are mostly affected, it's now all of us realizing we got to go on this journey together. So I think that's where the fatigue is setting in. But some people just don't get the opportunity to be fatigued, right? This is their day-to-day experience. They show up, they compartmentalize, they perform. And so wouldn't it be great if we could just share that with everyone so that not one person is taking on the burden of trying to move our organizations forward?
No, I love that. And it really speaks to the fact that you need people to be engaged in a D&I journey for the long run. You know, you don't have the luxury of kind of jumping in and saying, oh, yes, I am absolutely all about, you know, making sure that we have equality for women and that they're treated right, you know, during the Me Too movement. And then you jump right back out and you're no longer an ally because, you know, for the individuals who are part of any of these groups, you know, I don't have the luxury of jumping in and being Black at one point and then jumping out and not being Black at another point. And so, you know, you're right. Wouldn't it be great if we had the luxury of saying, oh, I'm tired of the way these things are. I'm no longer going to discuss it. Well, that doesn't really happen if you're living it every day. Either of the other two panelists hear anything about this diversity fatigue and have any responses to it?
Sure, I'll go next. You know, I was worried as we got through this year at my company because there was a lot of momentum and I was like, oh, I don't want people to get complacent and feel like, especially the leaders, like, oh, we've done that. I think what's helped is as we've gotten here to the end of the year, and again, now have been watching more visibility to the data. It's like, yay, we've done, again, raised awareness and we're in a different place, but boy, we have a lot of work to do. And that's helped actually the CEO to get kind of work back up again. And so we're just launching now. One of my peers here mentioned having committee. We are just launching our kind of D&I business advisory committee. We're going to go deeper on as we go into the next year, really looking at the executive committee having kind of a D&I plan. So not just seeing the metrics and kind of talking about it, but what's going to be your plan. And I see that as some of the best practices from some other places. So actually, I think one, the data helped, but I'll share too, as a public company, the investors are not letting up. So a lot around ESG, a big part of it's diversity. There's no let up at all. So, you know, my company, we do report D&I to the board. It was just this week we had a board meeting and looking at corporate social responsibility report that we'll need to publish and 10K, and 100% those investors are expecting more data from a D&I. And so we're going to be doing more there that will help with transparency internally too as we go into next year. So from a public company, the shareholders are not letting steam off, you know, this focus.
Right. So again, you don't have the luxury of saying, you know, we're tired, but I just want to amplify and underscore something that you said. You report on D&I to your board of directors. Mm-hmm. Hopefully for anyone who was, you know, washing dishes or taking out the dog and just listening to the webinar, you heard me when I repeated that. That's how you know that you're really making sure that it's woven in through the fabric of your organization, because the board is hearing about all the things that matter. And so the fact that D&I is on that agenda, that is extremely powerful. Veronica, I know, understanding that you've just made a shift in your career and you've just, you know, gone to a new organization, there's a question in the chat that I think is very appropriate for you to at least begin the conversation on. And it's around starting to put together some kind of a, you know, D&I strategy. And the question is, you know, when you're going from having an organization that has been used to having like a D&I committee, doing some very discrete programming, you know, we have something we do for Black History Month and something we do for Pride Month, to now having a strategy. What are some of the things that you need to think about as you're putting together a D&I strategy strategy, and just generally, if any of the panelists can think about some of your best tips as you are transitioning, an organization from those discrete D&I programs to now having an overall D&I strategy.
Sure. I'd say definitely those listening tours are very valuable, gathering employee sentiment. Typically, companies send out at least an annual survey about what it's like working there. If that doesn't exist, that's a way to gather some feedback where you could ask if the person is comfortable disclosing their gender or their race and ethnicity, so that you can then dissect the data later on and see, oh, we're having a challenge with women feeling supported by their managers. Let's dial into this. So I think first is to just know what are the top challenges at your organizations. And then if you don't have a formal DE&I team, there's been siloed efforts. I think it could feel intimidating to take on all that you could do. So maybe just focusing in on your sphere of influence. If you work in HR, putting together workshops, how can you weave in DE&I into the workshops that you're putting together? Performance reviews, how can you remind people of biases that might come up in performance reviews and put that front and center? If you're in engineering, what's your sphere of influence there? So I'd say it definitely helps to have a centralized team and to have leadership support. But as you get to that point, just trying to connect the dots with all the smaller efforts that you could be doing to support the people across the organization.
I love it. And for me, I kind of taken that a step further when I joined my current firm. You do those listening tours that we already talked about, and you find out from the folks, what's on your mind, what are the challenges that you're facing, and what can we be doing better to support you. But after every listening tour and every audit, you need to do some sort of a SWOT analysis. Let's find out what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the threats as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you present those kind of key findings to your board of directors, you bring that back to your D&I council, and then there is where your action plan can come, because you're literally outlining, here are our opportunities in this organization, here is where we're weak, and here are the threats. And also, of course, understanding those strengths, because where can you build on those strengths? What are we already doing well, and how can we do it even better, or maybe even replicate that? So for instance, in many organizations, they have a number of affinity groups or ERGs. And you oftentimes will see, as people are along their D&I journey, the women's affinity group is light years ahead of, the affinity group for, your LGBT employees, or for your employees of color. What are we doing over there that makes that group so strong that we can replicate and bring to those other groups? And so a lot of that, kind of taking that listening tour and synthesizing that information and turning it into a SWOT analysis was extremely helpful for me. But Rashida, what did you do when you came to Wiley to put together a D&I plan? What were some of your first steps?
Yeah, so for me, I kind of like Veronica. I was a team of one. And so the first step was figuring out from a talent acquisition, like what type of role and what type of individual would help, round out the organization about, and really understanding where we have been doing, like we've housed diversity efforts. So it was in our legal talent, in our HR, as well as thinking about it in a different way in other parts of the organization, like with respect to marketing or something like that. And so I did the same thing, but I did the listening tour at our senior leadership level. And so I'm looking forward going to 2022 to expand that more so out within the whole organization, because one of the things is, the nice thing about our firm is we have one office, right? And so the advantage of having one office is that everybody's here and we're co-located and be able to have those conversations. I think what's interesting that I really took away from today's discussion, because one of the great things about having these conversations is I always walk away with some great learnings and I'm like, oh, I'm excited to implement this in my own organization, is talking about, the annual survey. I don't think we're really doing it in a way that can provide us that kind of real-time feedback. And then I also think from the standpoint of the affinity group is initially, because our organization was small, we had our affinity group. So it's kind of like affinity group 1.0. But how do we take it to the next level? How do we use that and partner with the executive leaders from our executive committee in doing that sponsorship? So for me, I think I really spent the year on kind of cultural fluency and infrastructure. And then now that I've had a baseline and now I have a team, it is about taking it to the next level and how do we, permeate and make ourselves known throughout the entire organization so that ultimately, little by little, people recognize there is value in that. And I think a lot of times the reliance has been on affinity groups to have that connective tissue throughout the organization. But I think Brenda mentioned, like, what is a ROI? Or Veronica, did you mention ROI? And so really being very intentional about how we're measuring the affinity group success. So it's not just there for social purposes, which is a great thing, but we're in this moment where we have social, but we actually have a lot to do. So we're gonna have to find another time to be social.
Or do that on the side and make sure we also get through this agenda. Speaking of which, oh my gosh, we're getting so far through our agenda. We're almost at the end of our time here. But I know, Brenda, that there are a number of people who tuned in because number one, you all are such amazing thought leaders. But number two, they're also interested in positions like yours. And so they are trying to find out how they can actually get into the D&I space, how they can get into a DEI role. Do you recommend any particular trainings or certifications, any education or et cetera to be effective or to actually get into this particular space?
Well, first, I welcome hearing from my peers here to see if there are education certifications, because I know there's different things out there, but I bet if there's anything you'd recommend. So from my perspective, that's great. And if we do, if there's something standard that people recommend, I'd take that back with me as well. But I would say, from just people come into the D&I all different ways. And so like I've been more of a HR leader of almost every function in different ways, but really had D&I as a focus before I came into the diversity and inclusion officer, okay, role. But I think different ways people can come in. One is, if you're in the HR function, can you, like, if you're in recruiting, is there a lead you can take around focusing on diversity or inclusion within the recruiting function, or in comp, or as an HR partner? Because you can always kind of take on that lead and working with the D&I team, and that helps get exposure, working on different projects. Or if you're just, within the business, anywhere within the business, and really want to get into the field of D&I think the more you could lean in this particular area, be a chapter lead or be in our employee resource group, or kind of take an initiative, tap the D&I team. And we do have a lot of people that come forward and said, how can I help? So sometimes it's not always clear that this is the exact way, but I think the more you get involved in contributing in the space, that can lead you indirectly into a full-time role, or at least part of your responsibilities. So again, people come in from many different ways. We also have people, if you're doing like affirmative action plans and you move into the D&I space in a different way, or vice versa. So I would just think about, just ways to contribute to the space. And then, that's one way to come directly into the field. And then also just looking at best practices, look up CEO action. There's a lot of different things out there. Network, reach out to others who are in the area, and you can probably learn, and that can open up different doors for you in many different ways as well.
Love it. Veronica, what's your advice? Someone who wants to get into the D&I space.
Sure, I'd add on, if you have any learning and development experience, putting together workshops or working with vendors to do that, that's really helpful in this space. If you have communications or marketing experience, I mean, we're always at the ready to respond to crisis moments. As a company, ever since last year, companies are now expected to respond internally and externally. So if you have any expertise with communications and drafting, that'll also transfer over very well. Marketing, understanding the consumer, this time being the people in your organization, HR, all really helpful fields that could transfer over. And then I know over the past few years, I believe like eCornell has offered a diversity and inclusion certificate that you can sometimes get expensed from your company. So I know some of these certifications might be a hefty price tag if you're thinking about it from your individual budget, but try to ask your companies if they offer any learning reimbursements where they could pay for certifications or classes around DE&I.
Don't try to ask. Make sure you ask.
Yes,
It's a critical
yeah.
function of your continued education. As we get down to our last couple of minutes here, I just really wanted to give everyone, a quick 30 seconds or so to talk about what's next. So it's been a year for us to find out, where we are now, but what are you going to be working on in 2022? What is at the top of your agenda? I'm trying to find out kind of where this DEI continuum is going as we go into the new year. So we'll do it in this order. We'll go Rashida, Brenda, Veronica.
Great, thank you, Lloyd. This has been such a delightful conversation. It's gone by so fast. I'm so sorry to see it end. But I think one of the things that I'm really taking with me into the new year is this whole ability for us to connect and be very intentional. And a lot of times, we're on such a fast pace that we have to have these monumental changes. But it's really about making those personal connections with people within your organization. And then one person connects with another person, connects with another person, and really using that aspect of saying, we are really more similar than we are different, even though we are really focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But having that ability for us to find the commonality and really think about how can we be kind to each other, because I think that over the last 18 months, what we have learned is that we need to be resilient. And about being resilient is that all of us come together to make a beautiful mosaic. And if we're not really intentional about recognizing and valuing each person that's coming into our organization, we're not going to really have the maximum benefit that the organization can grow. So I will be talking about kindness next year. I will be talking about connection, and I'll be talking about belonging. Love it.
Brenda?
I do too. I like that a lot. Right now, what we're looking at is, again, kind of going deeper into looking at some root cause. So now that we've got a lot of momentum in certain areas, how do we make sure we start to see the change as far as moving our people up in our organization, see more results in hiring diverse talent, retaining diverse talent. So it'll be kind of this D&I advisory council, getting the leaders to do their kind of D&I plans with us helping them. So that way they feel a sense of ownership and accountability across the company. And just taking some of the learnings that we've gained from things like unconscious bias and how do we reinforce that and go a little bit deeper as we go into this coming year.
All right, Veronica.
I'll just add super quickly, like I said, my company is new to having a DEI team. So now they're going to have consistency going forward and a strategy that's coming from a team that's holding them all accountable with different work streams, whether it's internally focused or externally focused. And then I'd also add the last 2 years have been very remote based, but it's seeming like next year there could be some more hybrid opportunities. So while we're not forcing people back into the office, people have been going in, but then there are still people who will not go in. So making sure we're tracking, especially in performance reviews, if there's a difference in treatment, are those going in getting more preferential treatment because they're getting more exposure to the senior leaders who are also in the office. So new dimension to keep in mind, I think, in 2022.
Love that. Equity audits never get enough time and attention. Perfect. Thank you to all of the panelists for all of your insight. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being so open and so honest. I'm sure all of the attendees appreciate it. And thank you to Rutgers for having us. John, you want to close it out?
Yes, thank you, Lloyd. And very quickly, this panel is just tremendous. It was great and it was real dialogue. So Lloyd, thank you for moderating it, and Brenda, Veronica, and Rashida, thank you for participating and sharing your wisdom. For our audience, we are wishing you a wonderful holiday season and a great 2022 as we continue to grow, not only around this topic, but others, as Veronica alluded to, either elect to go back or choose not to. But keep your ears and eyes open for new programming around the AWE Business Forum, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2022. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.